Don't stand up, Adrian Carter whispered to himself as his fingers tightened around the edge of the crystal water glass. If she looks at you right now, everything you think you know about your marriage is going to fall apart. He had walked into Belmont House expecting nothing more dramatic than a quiet business lunch with two investors from Chicago. Instead, across the elegant dining room beneath soft amber lights and the gentle notes of a piano, he saw his pregnant wife. Evelyn Brooks sat alone near the panoramic windows overlooking the river, one hand resting lightly on the curve of her 7-month belly while the other traced the rim of a porcelain coffee cup. She wasn't dressed like someone hiding a secret. She wore a simple ivory maternity dress, comfortable flats, and the same wedding band he had slipped onto her finger 3 years earlier. She looked exactly like the woman who always smiled when he left for work. Exactly like the woman who insisted she preferred staying away from boardrooms and business dinners. That should have been the end of the story. It should have been comforting. Instead, it became the beginning of a mystery Adrian would spend the next several days trying and failing to understand. A line of black SUVs rolled silently to the entrance outside the restaurant. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Adrian noticed 3 men and 2 women in tailored suits step out almost simultaneously. They weren't carrying shopping bags or flowers. They carried tablets, leather portfolios, and the unmistakable confidence of executives who answered to someone important. Adrian barely glanced at them before returning to his conversation, assuming they belonged to another corporate meeting. Then every one of them walked directly toward Evelyn. None of them hesitated. None of them looked around the room. The oldest among them stopped beside her chair, smiled respectfully, and spoke just loudly enough for Adrian to hear 4 words that made the room seem strangely quiet. "Good afternoon, boss." The spoon slipped from Adrian's hand and clinked sharply against the marble floor. No one at Evelyn's table reacted with surprise. In fact, they acted as though calling her boss was the most natural thing in the world. One of the women handed Evelyn a folder thick with documents. Another placed a tablet in front of her. Evelyn nodded calmly, adjusted her glasses, and began turning pages with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Adrian couldn't move. His wife hated business meetings. At least, that's what she had always told him. She claimed financial reports gave her headaches. She laughed whenever he talked about mergers. She often teased that she barely remembered what EBITDA meant. Had all of that been an act? His investors continued talking, but their voices faded into meaningless background noise. Adrian watched Evelyn carefully. She wasn't pretending. Every decision she made at that table happened without hesitation. People listened when she spoke. They took notes. They waited before responding. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody questioned her. For the first time since Adrian had met the woman he married, he realized he had absolutely no idea who she was once she walked out the front door each morning. He replayed countless conversations inside his mind. Every prenatal appointment she attended alone because she insisted he stay focused on work. Every phone call she politely excused herself to answer in another room. Every afternoon she returned home saying traffic had been terrible. Every unexplained smile whenever he asked how her day had gone. He had never doubted her honesty. Now he wondered whether he had simply never asked the right questions. Across the restaurant, Evelyn signed a document, slid it back across the table, and accepted another without even looking toward him. She hadn't noticed her husband sitting less than 50 feet away. Or perhaps she had noticed and chose not to let it show. Adrian remained seated long after the executives had gathered around Evelyn's table, but he could no longer hear a single word from the investors across from him. Every assumption he had built over the past 3 years seemed to loosen at once, like a carefully stacked tower beginning to shift under its own weight. His wife had never asked for designer handbags. She had never cared about luxury vacations or expensive jewelry. Whenever he offered to upgrade their lifestyle, she would simply smile and say she already had everything she needed. At the time, he had considered it modesty. Now he wondered whether it had been something entirely different. The meeting across the room continued with remarkable efficiency. One executive projected financial charts onto a tablet, while another quietly summarized numbers that Adrian could not quite hear. Evelyn listened without interrupting, occasionally asking short questions that were answered immediately. Nobody attempted to impress her. Nobody dominated the conversation. They behaved like experienced professionals who already understood exactly where the final decision would come from. Adrian had spent 15 years building his reputation in commercial real estate. He knew executive body language better than most people knew their own relatives. Respect like that could not be faked. It had to be earned over years. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Evelyn. Hope your lunch goes well. Do not work too hard today. Love you. The timestamp showed it had been sent 12 minutes earlier, right before the executives arrived. Adrian stared at the screen. She had known he was in the same restaurant. She had known all along. Yet she had not mentioned her own meeting. Why? He typed a reply, then erased it. He started another sentence, then deleted that one as well. Nothing felt right anymore. The investors finally noticed his distraction. One of them smiled politely and asked if everything was all right. Adrian forced a brief nod and apologized, blaming a busy schedule. It was the easiest explanation available, even if it was completely untrue. His attention drifted back toward Evelyn just in time to see one of the executives slide a thick folder across the table. The cover displayed only a discreet silver emblem that Adrian did not immediately recognize. Evelyn opened it, reviewed several pages with calm precision, then signed near the bottom without hesitation. Everyone around her visibly relaxed after the signature. One of the executives even smiled with unmistakable relief, as though weeks of uncertainty had finally ended. Adrian knew that feeling. He had seen it countless times after multi-million-dollar contracts closed. Yet somehow his wife, the woman who claimed she disliked corporate negotiations, had just produced that exact reaction with nothing more than a signature. 20 minutes later, the meeting concluded. Chairs moved quietly across the polished floor. Every executive stood before Evelyn did. Several thanked her personally. One older gentleman shook her hand with both of his and said, "We appreciate your confidence, ma'am." Another carefully gathered the signed documents before placing them into a locked leather portfolio. Adrian instinctively reached for his wallet as Evelyn prepared to leave, expecting her to search for her purse or ask for the check. Instead, the restaurant manager hurried over with a warm smile and simply said, "Everything has already been arranged, Ms. Brooks. We look forward to welcoming you back next week." She thanked him graciously and walked toward the exit without looking around the dining room. Adrian remained frozen in his chair until the front doors closed behind her. Then he quietly excused himself from his own meeting, stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, and watched the black SUVs disappear into downtown traffic. For the first time in his marriage, he realized that he was not trying to figure out where his wife had gone. He was trying to figure out who she had been all along. Evelyn waited until the restaurant doors closed behind the last executive before allowing herself a slow breath. The meeting had ended exactly as she hoped, but not for the reason anyone around the table believed. They thought she had been calculating market projections and approving acquisition strategies. In reality, her thoughts had drifted toward a man sitting less than 50 feet away, a man who had unknowingly watched a version of her she had promised herself he would never have to see. She rested one hand gently against her growing belly as the elevator carried her toward the underground parking garage. The baby shifted softly, almost as if responding to her racing heartbeat. "I know," she whispered with a faint smile. "Everything is changing." Her assistant, Lauren Pierce, waited beside the elevator holding a leather portfolio. "The board is thrilled," Lauren said. "The acquisition committee has already scheduled the final review for Friday morning." Evelyn nodded without celebrating. "Delay the announcement until next week." Lauren looked surprised. "That may complicate negotiations." "I know," Evelyn answered quietly. "Please do it anyway." Lauren had worked beside Evelyn for almost 6 years. She had learned long ago not to question decisions that sounded emotional on the surface, but eventually proved remarkably strategic. She simply nodded and updated the schedule on her tablet. As the car pulled away from the restaurant, the city passed quietly outside the tinted windows. Evelyn watched familiar streets. Evelyn arrived at Brooks Capital headquarters just before 3 o'clock that afternoon. From the outside, the 42-story glass tower blended into the skyline like every other corporate building downtown. There were no giant signs carrying her family name, no photographs of her hanging in the lobby. Years ago, she had insisted that the company operate without building its reputation around a single person. Investors trusted performance, not personalities. That philosophy had quietly transformed Brooks Capital into one of the most respected private investment firms in the country without attracting unnecessary public attention. As the private elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, conversations paused for only a second before continuing. Nobody rushed toward her in dramatic fashion. Nobody applauded. They simply acknowledged her with polite greetings before returning to work. That was exactly how Evelyn preferred it. Competence did not need an audience. Lauren stepped beside her carrying the updated acquisition schedule. The legal team completed the final review, she said. Only your authorization remains before Friday. Evelyn accepted the folder without opening it immediately. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the entire financial district stretching beneath a cloudy afternoon sky. Somewhere among those towers stood Carter Development, the company Adrian had spent more than a decade building. She had celebrated every expansion with him, every new contract, every ribbon-cutting ceremony. She had listened patiently when projects failed and quietly encouraged him after difficult quarters. He believed those conversations came from a supportive wife. He never realized many of her suggestions came from years of experience sitting at boardroom tables very much like this one. Lauren waited until the room emptied before speaking again. There is one issue you should know. Evelyn turned toward her. Go ahead. Lauren placed another document on the desk. Carter Development is listed as one of the companies included in the Horizon commercial portfolio. Evelyn slowly lowered her eyes to the page. Horizon commercial portfolio. The acquisition they had been negotiating for nearly 6 months. Hundreds of office buildings, industrial properties, and development contracts spread across multiple states. It was the largest investment Brooks Capital had considered in years. Evelyn had approved every stage based on financial merit alone. She had never personally reviewed every subsidiary. Now one familiar company name changed everything. Carter Development was not the primary target. It was only one business among dozens included in the transaction. Yet if Brooks Capital completed the purchase, Adrian's largest lender and principal investment partner would suddenly answer to her board. Silence settled across the office. Lauren finally asked the obvious question. Would you like to remove Carter Development from the agreement? Evelyn remained thoughtful for several long moments. Every instinct told her to protect Adrian from the uncomfortable truth waiting just ahead. Every executive responsibility told her to treat his company exactly like every other asset under review. Personal feelings and corporate obligations had finally reached the same intersection. No, Evelyn answered quietly. Do not change the transaction. Lauren studied her expression carefully. Are you certain? Evelyn nodded. Changing the agreement because of my marriage would be unfair to every investor depending on us. We will evaluate Carter Development using the same standards we apply to everyone else. Lauren accepted the decision without argument. She had expected nothing less. After she left, Evelyn finally opened the detailed acquisition report. Financial statements, property valuations, debt schedules, projected returns. Then one page stopped her completely. Carter Development had been experiencing increasing cash flow pressure for nearly 8 months. Several refinancing agreements would expire within weeks. Without additional capital, expansion plans would likely stall before the end of the quarter. Adrian had never mentioned any of it. He had smiled every evening, insisted business was excellent, and reassured her that everything was under control. Evelyn gently closed the folder and rested both hands over her baby. A bittersweet smile crossed her face. They had both been protecting secrets. The difference was that hers had been chosen. His had been carried alone. Neither of them realized that within a matter of days those two hidden worlds were about to collide inside the same boardroom. And when they did, neither their marriage nor their understanding of each other would ever be the same again. Adrian barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image replaying with perfect clarity. Evelyn sitting calmly at the head of that restaurant table while seasoned executives waited for her approval before making a single decision. By sunrise, he had convinced himself there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps she was helping a charity board. Perhaps one of her relatives owned a small business he had never heard about. Perhaps the word boss was nothing more than an affectionate nickname. Yet every explanation sounded weaker than the last. Before leaving for the office, he watched Evelyn preparing breakfast in the kitchen. She hummed softly while arranging fresh fruit onto a plate and smiled when she noticed him standing in the doorway. Nothing about her appeared unusual. She asked whether he wanted coffee, reminded him about his afternoon meeting, and laughed when the baby gave another gentle kick. It was the same warm woman he had loved since the day they met. The mystery only became more unsettling because she acted so completely normal. Adrian almost asked about the restaurant. The words reached the back of his throat before disappearing again. Instead, he kissed her forehead, wished her a good day, and walked out the front door carrying far more questions than answers. By mid-morning, he found himself staring through the windows of his office instead of reviewing construction proposals. Finally, he picked up his phone and called Daniel Foster, an old college friend who now operated a respected corporate intelligence firm. Daniel specialized in due diligence before major acquisitions. If anyone could quietly answer a few questions without attracting attention, it would be him. Daniel listened patiently before asking one simple question. Are you asking as a businessman or as a husband? Adrian hesitated longer than he expected. I honestly do not know anymore. Daniel agreed to make a few discreet inquiries, but warned him that privacy laws limited what could legally be collected. Adrian appreciated the reminder. He wanted the truth, not an invasion of Evelyn's personal life. Even so, something deep inside him insisted there was a missing piece connecting everything he had witnessed. Late that afternoon, Daniel called back much sooner than expected. I found something strange, he said. Your wife is almost invisible. Adrian frowned. What does that mean? It means there is almost no public information attached to her professional history. No executive profiles. No interviews. No social media discussing business. It is unusually clean. Adrian leaned forward. That is impossible. Not impossible, Daniel replied thoughtfully. Intentional. Adrian remained silent. Daniel continued. There are traces of private aviation records connected to a trust with the Brooks family name. There are invitations to investment conferences where the guest list is sealed. There are references to confidential board meetings that never identify participants. Every trail ends just before revealing who actually attended. Adrian thanked him and ended the call, but the conversation only deepened the mystery. That evening, while driving home, he noticed something else he had somehow ignored for years. Evelyn rarely carried handbags with visible designer logos. She never spoke about expensive purchases. She never bragged about money. Looking back, she had never once asked him how much he earned after their wedding. At the time, he believed it reflected humility. Now it felt as though finances had never impressed her because she already lived in a world where wealth required no explanation. When Adrian pulled into the driveway, another surprise waited. A black luxury sedan was parked beside the house. The driver stepped out, greeted Evelyn respectfully, handed her a sealed envelope, and departed less than 30 seconds later without ringing the doorbell or asking any questions. Evelyn quietly placed the envelope into a desk drawer before joining Adrian for dinner, as though nothing unusual had happened. She smiled across the table, asked about his meetings, and listened with genuine interest while he described a construction project. Adrian answered every question, yet his attention kept drifting toward the closed drawer across the room. For the first time since they married, he realized that the greatest secret inside their home might not belong to a locked cabinet or a hidden safe. It might belong to the quiet woman sitting directly across from him, smiling as though she had nothing at all to hide. The questions Adrian had managed to suppress for 2 days finally became impossible to ignore. On Thursday evening, he arrived home earlier than usual and found the house unusually quiet. Soft piano music drifted from the living room while the scent of fresh tea filled the air. Evelyn sat near the fireplace reading a hardcover book, one hand absent-mindedly resting on her growing belly as afternoon sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. She looked peaceful, almost untouched by the storm gathering inside his mind. Adrian stood there for several seconds before she looked up and smiled. "You are home early," she said warmly. "I thought we could have dinner together." Normally, that simple sentence would have erased every ounce of stress from his day. This time it only reminded him how little he truly understood about the woman standing in front of him. He sat across from her without removing his coat. Evelyn closed the book immediately. She could read his expression better than anyone. "Something happened," she said softly. Adrian nodded once. "I need to ask you something." Her smile faded, replaced by quiet concern. "Of course." He hesitated, searching for words that would not sound like an accusation. "On Tuesday, I saw you at Belmont House." Evelyn remained perfectly still, not surprised, not defensive, simply listening. Adrian continued. "There were executives with you. They called you boss. Silence settled between them. The ticking grandfather clock suddenly sounded much louder than usual. Evelyn lowered her eyes for only a moment before meeting his gaze again. I wondered how long it would take before you asked. That answer unsettled Adrian even more than a denial would have. So it is true? She nodded gently. Yes. He leaned forward. Who are those people? Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the drawer beside the sofa, the same drawer where Adrian had seen the mysterious envelope disappear the night before. She removed a small brass key attached to an old leather keychain worn smooth from years of use. Without saying a word, she placed it on the coffee table between them. Adrian stared at it, confused. What is this? Do you remember the apartment where we first met? She asked. Adrian blinked in surprise. How could he forget? 8 years earlier, before either of them imagined marriage, they had met at a charity fundraiser hosted inside a beautifully restored downtown penthouse overlooking the river. They had talked for nearly 4 hours beside the balcony while the rest of the guests slowly disappeared into the night. Adrian smiled despite himself. Of course I remember. Evelyn gently slid the key toward him. That apartment has always belonged to me. Adrian frowned. I thought the building developer owned it. Evelyn shook her head. The developer leased the event space from my family. The property has been in our portfolio for nearly 15 years. Adrian looked from the key back to her face. His thoughts began racing through countless memories. Every anniversary, they celebrated there. Every conversation about how beautiful the view was. Every time he assumed someone else had been generous enough to provide the venue. He had never once questioned why reservations were always available whenever Evelyn requested them. She smiled sadly. You once told me that if you became successful enough, you would buy that penthouse so we could grow old there together. Adrian remembered saying exactly those words. Evelyn continued quietly. I never corrected you because your dream mattered more to me than the paperwork behind the building. Adrian picked up the old brass key. It felt unexpectedly heavy. Why did you keep all of this from me? Evelyn looked toward the fading sunset outside the windows before answering. Because I wanted to know that someone loved Evelyn Brooks before they ever cared about what came with my last name. Adrian lowered his eyes to the key resting in his palm. For the first time, he understood that the greatest secret in their marriage had never been hidden inside locked files, corporate towers, or confidential meetings. It had been carried every single day by the woman who had quietly chosen love over recognition, hoping she would never have to explain the difference. The conversation ended without raised voices, yet Adrian felt as though the ground beneath his carefully ordered life had shifted forever. He sat alone in his office early the next morning, the old brass key still resting in his desk drawer. He had opened it 3 times since arriving, studying it as if another secret might somehow appear between the worn grooves of the metal. Instead of finding answers, he found himself replaying every conversation he and Evelyn had shared over the years. Every time she quietly encouraged patience when he rushed into a risky investment. Every gentle suggestion that later proved remarkably accurate. Every moment he assumed her wisdom came from intuition rather than experience. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His chief financial officer, Melissa Grant, stepped inside carrying a folder with an expression Adrian rarely saw on her face. She looked concerned. The refinancing committee called this morning, she said carefully. They moved our review meeting to tomorrow. Adrian frowned. They were supposed to meet next month. Melissa nodded. I know. Something changed overnight. She placed several reports across his desk. Rising interest rates, tightening credit conditions, delayed funding commitments. None of the numbers looked catastrophic by themselves, yet together they painted a picture Adrian could no longer ignore. Carter Development had expanded aggressively over the previous 2 years, expecting financing conditions to remain favorable. Now several major lenders wanted additional guarantees before extending new credit. Can we bridge the gap ourselves? Adrian asked. Melissa slowly shook her head. Not without bringing in another institutional partner. Adrian leaned back silently. He had built his company through confidence and persistence, but confidence alone could not replace liquidity. Melissa hesitated before speaking again. There is another rumor circulating. Adrian looked up. What rumor? Several firms believe Brooks Capital is preparing a significant acquisition in the commercial property sector. Adrian felt an unexpected chill. Brooks Capital. The name now carried an entirely different meaning. Melissa continued. Nobody knows exactly which portfolio they are targeting, but if the reports are accurate, whoever controls that transaction will gain considerable influence across the market. Adrian dismissed the meeting a few minutes later, but found it impossible to concentrate. By late afternoon, he drove home earlier than usual. Evelyn was sitting on the back patio, enjoying the cool breeze with a blanket draped lightly over her shoulders. She smiled when she saw him walking toward her. "You escaped work before sunset," she said. Adrian smiled faintly as he joined her. "That almost never happens." They sat together in comfortable silence for several moments. Birds crossed the evening sky while the first porch lights appeared across the neighborhood. It was the kind of peaceful evening they had always treasured. Finally, Adrian spoke. "How long have you been leading Brooks Capital?" Evelyn looked toward the garden before answering. "Almost 6 years." Adrian slowly nodded. "Longer than we have been married." "Yes." There was no accusation in her voice. Only honesty. "Did you ever want to tell me?" Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Every single day." Adrian turned toward her. "Then why did you not?" She rested both hands gently over her baby before replying. "Because every time I tried, I saw how proud you were of building something with your own hands. I never wanted you to wonder whether people respected your success because of your work or because of my family." Adrian lowered his eyes. The realization settled heavily inside him. She had hidden her influence not to deceive him, but to protect his confidence. Before he could respond, Evelyn's phone vibrated softly on the table. She glanced at the screen for only a second before her expression became thoughtful. Adrian noticed the sender's name only briefly. "Lauren." Evelyn quietly locked the phone and looked back toward the sunset. "Tomorrow is going to be a very important day," she said. Adrian nodded, unaware that the meeting waiting for him the following morning would place his company, his marriage, and his understanding of success into the very same room for the first time. The following morning began with an unusual stillness. Adrian arrived at the conference center nearly 30 minutes early, hoping to gather his thoughts before the refinancing committee assembled. The lobby buzzed quietly with attorneys, financial advisors, and executives moving between meeting rooms, each carrying folders that represented months of negotiations. Carter Development had survived difficult markets before, but this meeting felt different. There was an invisible weight hanging over every conversation. Melissa joined him near the registration desk, carrying updated financial reports. "The committee requested one final agenda revision," she said. "Apparently, the lead investment group changed overnight." Adrian frowned. "Do we know who they are?" Melissa shook her head. "Only that they are represented by Brooks Capital." Hearing those two words spoken aloud inside a room connected to his own company created an uncomfortable silence between them. Before Adrian could respond, an assistant invited everyone into the executive boardroom. The room was elegant without being extravagant. A polished walnut table stretched nearly 40 feet beneath modern lighting, while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline Adrian had spent years helping shape through his developments. Nameplates had already been arranged in perfect order. Carter Development occupied one side of the table. Across from them, several seats remained empty. Attorneys quietly organized documents while analysts connected presentation screens. Then the doors opened. The room immediately grew quieter. Lauren Pierce entered first, followed by several senior executives Adrian recognized from the restaurant. Their expressions remained calm and professional as they took their assigned seats. Every conversation stopped for just a moment, not out of fear, but out of respect. Adrian watched the entrance without realizing he had stopped breathing. A second later, Evelyn walked into the room. She wore a tailored navy maternity dress beneath a light blazer, carrying only a slim leather portfolio. She looked composed, confident, and remarkably familiar all at once. It was still the same woman who laughed at old movies on Sunday evenings and insisted on making homemade pancakes every weekend. Yet inside this room, she carried herself with the quiet authority Adrian had first witnessed at the restaurant. Nobody announced her arrival. They did not need to. Every executive around the table stood before she even reached her chair. Several greeted her respectfully. One senior attorney simply said, "Good morning, Chairwoman Brooks." Adrian felt the final pieces of the mystery fall into place. Evelyn acknowledged everyone with a gracious smile before taking the seat directly opposite him. Their eyes met for only a brief moment. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet understanding that the truth could no longer remain hidden. The meeting officially began. Financial analysts reviewed market conditions, refinancing structures, and long-term investment strategies. Adrian answered questions about Carter development with the confidence earned through years of experience. Evelyn listened carefully without interrupting. She occasionally made notes, but never attempted to dominate the discussion. Nearly an hour passed before the lead attorney presented the final acquisition documents. Brooks Capital has completed its review of the Horizon commercial portfolio, he announced. The committee requests authorization from the chair before execution. Every person around the table turned toward Evelyn. Adrian watched as she opened the portfolio that had rested quietly beside her throughout the meeting. Inside were the final agreements determining ownership of billions of dollars in commercial assets, including the lending structure supporting Carter development. She read the final page one last time, picked up her pen, and paused. The room became perfectly silent. Adrian realized that a single signature from the woman he loved would influence not only his company's future, but the future of countless employees, investors, and families connected to every project Carter development had ever begun. Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes from the document and looked directly at Adrian. For the first time since the meeting started, she smiled gently, not as the chairwoman of Brooks Capital, but as his wife. Then, with one calm signature, she made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The silence inside the boardroom lingered for several long seconds after Evelyn finished signing the final page. The lead attorney collected the agreement with careful hands and passed it to the legal team for confirmation. One by one, the remaining signatures were completed, the folders were closed, and the transaction officially became part of the record. No applause followed. No dramatic celebration interrupted the moment. The people seated around the table understood that the most important decisions rarely arrived with loud reactions. They arrived with quiet certainty. Adrian remained seated, watching Evelyn as though he were seeing her for the first time. She had not used her position to embarrass him. She had not mentioned their marriage in front of the board. She had treated Carter Development exactly as she had promised Lauren she would treat every company under review, fairly, professionally, and without favoritism. The meeting concluded a few minutes later. Executives slowly filtered into the hallway, discussing timelines, integration schedules, and future planning. Before Adrian could stand, Evelyn walked toward him carrying the same slim leather portfolio she had brought into the room. "Would you take a walk with me?" she asked gently. He nodded without hesitation. They left the conference center through a private exit that opened onto a quiet river walk several blocks away. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh rain while sunlight reflected across the water. For a while neither of them spoke. They simply walked beside each other, matching their pace as they had done countless evenings before. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "You could have told everyone who you were." Evelyn smiled softly. "What would that have changed?" He looked down at the sidewalk. "Maybe they would have understood why I never knew." She shook her head. "That was never their story to understand. It was ours." Adrian stopped walking and faced her. "I spent years believing I was protecting our future." Evelyn reached for his hand. "And you were, just in a different way than I was." He looked at her with quiet regret. "I kept worrying about becoming successful enough to deserve you." Evelyn squeezed his hand gently. "Adrian, I never married your balance sheet. I married the man who volunteered every Saturday to help families rebuild after storms. I married the man who called his employees by name. I married the man who believed a handshake still meant something. None of those qualities had a price tag." His eyes drifted toward the river. "I feel as though I have been living beside someone extraordinary without ever asking enough questions." Evelyn laughed softly. "You asked plenty of questions, just not the ones about me." They both smiled. The weight that had surrounded them since the restaurant slowly began to fade. After another few steps, Evelyn opened her portfolio and handed him a single envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a framed ultrasound photo. Adrian looked up in confusion. "What is this?" "The letter was supposed to be your birthday surprise next month," she said. "I planned to tell you everything after the baby arrived. I wanted our child to grow up seeing two parents who trusted each other completely. Life simply decided the truth needed to arrive a little earlier." Adrian carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. "I still have a lot to learn." Evelyn smiled. "So do I. Marriage is not about knowing every secret on the first day. It is about deciding that every truth is worth facing together. As the sun settled lower across the skyline, they turned toward home, no longer separated by assumptions or hidden identities. Brooks Capital would continue making investments. Carter Development would continue building communities under its new financial structure. Their careers would remain demanding, and the months ahead would certainly bring new challenges. Yet the greatest change had nothing to do with boardrooms, contracts, or corporate titles. Adrian finally understood that real success was never measured by the company someone owned or the fortune attached to a family name. It was measured by the quiet strength to remain humble when you held power, the courage to choose trust over pride, and the wisdom to recognize the extraordinary person who had been walking beside you all along.